Revenue Officer for ICS. We are thankful to have ICS customers from really across the Northeast, representing New York, New England, Pennsylvania, and even some folks in the Mid-Atlantic joining us today. I want to start with, first thanking everybody for their business, their trust, their confidence in ICS. We do appreciate that. We are here working in service of you and your organization. We're together today to talk about a really important subject, and that's securing your organization's data in the cloud. We believe it is, our role to educate our customers on some of the challenges and potential risks associated with the way they operate their businesses. And so this is, kind of a blanket presentation on how to secure your data in the cloud. For those of you who are not aware, Integer Security is the cybersecurity division of ICS. I think it's important to point out that Integer employees' systems, operating goals, and objectives are entirely separate and distinct from ICS. With that, I'm going to introduce Dave D'Agostino. He's our Vice President of Integer, and he's going to guide us through a conversation today on cybersecurity. As we go through the presentation, and if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And at the end of the session, we'll get to as many questions as we possibly can. So without further ado, David, take us away.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm just going to give everyone a high overview of who we are. Integer. We are recognized as one of the top cybersecurity managed providers in the world. We've been recognized on this MSSP alert list for the last 2 years. What do we do? We specialize in compliance and security. We have a portfolio of services that go to fully managed services with proactive review, risk assessments. We provide project-based risk assessments, M&A assessments, security gaps, compliance audits, and penetration testing, which includes web application testing and internal and external network testing, vulnerability management, social engineering assessments, and we assist with cyber liability insurance through a third party. We have a unique approach that we believe resonates with our clients. It's a combination of people, process, and technology, and we leverage tools to help guide our analysts to review and inspect potential gaps or misconfigurations in our clients' environments to help provide a proactive approach to cybersecurity. So today I'm going to talk primarily around Microsoft 365 and the potential vulnerabilities and risks that come with that infrastructure. So the threat landscape, I'm sure many of you are aware, that's why you're on the call. We see these types of threats, attacks almost daily. And ultimately, we're seeing the primary point of entry and where email compromise and unpatched vulnerabilities. These are the two most common sources of a security breach. And we've come up with a very competitively priced and comprehensive offering to go in conjunction with your ICS managed services to add that layer of protection for our clients. And the reason for that is because, as you can see here, 94% of malware arrives via email. 85% of security breaches are attributed to unpatched or older software in your environment. Phishing attempts are continuing to be increasingly more sophisticated, targeted, and the methodologies that we're seeing continue to become more sophisticated, and we'll talk about some of those scenarios today. So email compromise, right? That's when someone actually gains access to your email, whether that's through some level of phishing or using credentials that may have been found through a previous breach that were leaked online. Phishing would be where someone gets an email and they have to reset their password. They believe they are through some Microsoft portal or maybe an HR system, and then someone gains access to your email unbeknownst to the user. This is where we're seeing just a tremendous increase in the activity and the amount of money that this is attributed to. Make no mistake, for these malicious actors and these organizations, this is a business, and they're focused solely on gaining information and leverage to to essentially blackmail you into paying a ransom, or potentially circumventing payment methods that you would be receiving by changing communication to some of your vendors or partners to wire differently. And we'll kind of talk about some of those things today. So convenience and security are not always aligned. Microsoft 365, a lot of organizations, are under the understanding that they moved off of their Exchange into this Microsoft 365 cloud. And with that, it's natively secure. The reality is that it's natively available. Really, the whole driving point of moving to the cloud is efficiencies, availability, and access, especially in the last few years where we went through that pandemic and many users had to work remotely and had to gain access to this information, whether they were working from a home PC or some type of device, phone, tablet, etc., off the network, remotely accessing not only their email, but we started to see the integration of these Teams applications and SharePoint and OneDrive and all this other information started to being implemented into the cloud in 365. And natively, it's available. Now, Microsoft over time has started to add more and more security features, but they're available to be developed and configured into an organization, but they're not natively on in all cases. In most cases, they're not. So there's more data they're making available through logging and collecting and inspecting that information. And they're creating more best practices, and just in general, there's best practices that are being developed around like multi-factor authentication and the separation of administrative accounts and testing that password, and then creating conditional access and all these different features that are continuing to be added and evolved over time. And so what that requires is a continual inspection and review, because the landscape is changing. It's an evolving infrastructure, and all these new changes are creating challenges, and in addressing those challenges and risk if they're monitored and managed correctly. So we'll move through here. The additional protection is needed. We're not alone in thinking this. This is information that's from a state of the email security from a company by the name of Mimecast, a security software provider. They're actually an email filtering company. And their survey, 90% of the participants believe that additional safeguards in 365 are necessary, and 80% of their organizations suffered a 365 outage in the last year. And 75% of companies were hurt by a ransomware attack, up from 61% the previous year. That was in 2021. We expect that number to continue to grow. It's most likely north of 80 for 2022. So what is Core? Core is our answer to some of these threats and vulnerabilities that we're seeing out there. Our security team will monitor the Microsoft 365 environment 24/7. We connect into what's called an API. It's basically all of this information, all that security information that's available in these logs, and we pull that into a system, and we correlate that, and we look at the anomalies. And we'll show that a little bit today for these suspicious and non-consistent behaviors. We do some machine learning behavior analytics. Part of that comes natively through Microsoft. We'll talk about impossible travel and suspicious activity. We also see a lot of information coming from teams and sharing information. We're in a meeting today. You probably do this often in your day-to-day work. And organizations will send a link or share a file within Teams, and they may be shared specifically to users in the environment. It may be shared to users in that meeting, or it may be shared as a link that anybody that gets that link can see that information. And so we want to identify that as a potential risk, understand what the impact would be, and then help organizations put some edges around that, reduce that threat landscape, and then monitor that for changes. We do the log management, which helps with compliance. So we're effectively collecting all that information, and so that we can go back and determine if there's an issue where it occurred and how to remediate it. We have defined playbooks, like I mentioned, to determine the methodology and the potential impact based on the information that we're seeing. And we review the 365 environment when we onboard a client. And then we go back on an annual basis and re-inspect that because of all these different changes and new features and modifications to make sure that there's least privileged access, there's multi-factor authentication enabled, that the administrative password isn't being shared and it's complex and can't be easily cracked. Those are things that we look at in conjunction with other things in regards to end user awareness training and the score around that. There's a Microsoft baseline security score that we'll provide on a monthly basis as part of the ongoing scanning. And we scan the environment for vulnerabilities. That's the entire environment, internally and externally, because that's the second most common threat vector. So there's these new patches that come out for applications and devices that are essentially like bugs in the code. And once those are identified, the malicious actors start identifying ways to exploit that potential vulnerability and then gain access to the environment. Very common. And we used to see a longer timeline to be able to create the remediation and patching. It usually would be, historically a couple weeks to a month would be adequate. And today, now we're seeing even hours and days once this information is identified and publicly available. The malicious actors start to use that. They have threat intelligence teams as well and developers to exploit those vulnerabilities sooner than our clients can patch. And so we believe that is a very cost-effective and very great and strong way to improve the posture of organizations by identifying vulnerabilities and then leveraging ICS to help patch those vulnerabilities. Types of things that we're going to see through the logging in the Microsoft 365, malicious administration changes, unauthorized delegated access. So someone is adding themselves to an email chain or they're accessing the mailboxes, failed or unauthorized access internally or externally through MFA or non, MFA removed or MFA changed. Somebody we'll talk about that a little bit later, what MFA fatigue is. A foreign login, so someone coming from outside of a region, suspicious or uncommon login, and we'll talk about that as well, where someone is logging in from a newer location than they typically have, even though it's not outside of the country. That'll throw a flag, and then we'll determine what next steps are. We'll talk about the risk scores of that. Impossible login, which is essentially someone logging in from two different locations, essentially Germany and the US within 2 hours, which is just impossible to travel to. So it's a common login. And then suspicious email forward. The impossible login is an interesting one. So, natively Microsoft was set up to be available from anywhere, anytime, anybody that had a username and password could log in with any device. That would not throw a red flag. And today it doesn't necessarily throw a red flag, but at least shows that information, so that should be reviewed. And whether it's a red flag or not is based off of us and our team reviewing that information and potentially escalating to ICS or potentially to the client to say, hey, is this user really outside of the country and working today? Because we feel like that might be suspicious, especially if they're logging in simultaneously from somewhere locally.
Hey, David, I think it's interesting to point out, in the old days, the firewall used to play this role, right? You'd look at your firewall logs and you'd say, where's the traffic coming from? And is it malicious traffic? And now that we're out in the cloud, we don't see traffic the same way, right? So that's really what that impossible login speaks to, is where are people trying to enter your Microsoft environment from, and does that line up with reasonability, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, that's a great point, Brian. That, in addition to, there was a VPN typically involved if you were logging into your Exchange, or then there was OWA enabled, but that was typically locked down to a specific device or user. Where today, this cloud, there's tremendous benefit to it, scalability and life cycle and continuous updates and features that we see every day added, and the uptime is ideal. And the redundancy, you won't have to worry about having power or third-party power sources in your environment or multiple ISPs to host your own server infrastructure. And those are all wonderful, and they add to availability and access. But that security layer still needs to kind of be looked at and scrutinized for various reasons. So another one we see is that you will know instantly if your email has been compromised. People feel like they'll find this out and they'll see it right away. There's a message that pops up, or they'll see suspicious activity. But typically, there's a number of different methods and what is referred to as playbooks that the malicious actors use to gain access. Sometimes we often see that they'll use that same login because it's tied back to an Active Directory account to gain access within the organization. Other times we'll see them go in and change an email rule where they'll forward the email to another mailbox and then just kind of read and sift and sit and be idle. It really depends on which user they were able to gain access to. Obviously, if it was somebody was in the executive level or in HR or in payroll, and they had access to sensitive data or to vendors that were sending and receiving money, they're going to typically sit and kind of wait and determine what's happening, what the cadence is, the methodology, who they're communicating with most often. And then they'll try to jump in the middle of that, and they'll send an email as that user because they have complete access to it. And we'll say, hey, we've changed our banking records, or we moved to a new bank. Can you please send all of your, receivables to this new address or this new wire transfer? We see that very often. It was very common during COVID because it wasn't uncommon for organizations to not be in the office, and they moved to electronic payments. And so a lot of organizations were sending these types of communications out to their vendors. And so, we saw these malicious actors kind of waiting and sitting, and then they would kind of jump in the middle of that communication and kind of fool the vendors into paying the wrong account. Other times, it's non-malicious, right? Sometimes a user, we see this often with outside sales forces or just people that are on the road and kind of, multitasking often. They'll try to consolidate email accounts. And so they'll join a new company and they'll forward that to a personal email where they have all their email in one device on their phone because it's user efficiency or friendliness. And they'll leave the organization, and then we'll see things happen where those email forwarding rules are still in place. We'll talk about one of those scenarios here in a moment. But what we also see is dwell time, right? So they gain access, but they don't necessarily encrypt or basically carry out a malicious act immediately. They start to move laterally or make slight minor changes that won't necessarily show up on the radar. But once you start to see those changes and you look at them over time and that they're not consistent with the user behavior up to this point, that's when it starts to throw a red flag. And so in that dwell time, from the time that they gain access and they actually start to create a malicious action, we have that visibility because we're collecting that information, and we can collect it and then identify it and isolate it and shut it down before it becomes either global or it impacting at all. And that's really important, because without that and those eyes on that 24/7, you're typically in reactive mode, and you're going back after the issue and trying to figure out how and why. And there's typically some level of financial ramification or reputational impact to the organization. So I'm going to walk through a few scenarios here to kind of explain the scenarios and situations that we see often in organizations, and how having this service will help identify and stop that from occurring. In this particular case, a CEO, similar to this scenario that I just talked about, he had their email account compromised, most likely through some phishing or some other way of gaining that access, whether that was through a dark web, leak or something like that. They gained access. They forwarded that information to a Gmail account. In this particular organization, I think this particular scenario here, this was a scenario that we saw from one of our insurance providers. They were able to kind of circumvent into the middle of this opportunity where there was a multi-million-dollar business transaction occurring, where there was going to be an acquisition of one organization to the next. And this person actually set up a Gmail account and then started emulating that organization and that CEO, and sent that communication on behalf of the CEO, emulating them. And several $1 million, I think it was over $2 million, was wired to the wrong account at the close. And it created a legal battle of who was responsible for what, and insurance obviously got involved. That's how we learned about this from one of our insurance partners. Another example all the time we see is the longstanding vendor relationship and redirecting funds because of a new banking relationship. And they act as if there's a new banking relationship, and they want all the funds wired to this new account because there's been a change at the company. We mentioned that we see that often during COVID. We still continue to see that. So those are other things that we'll see with that scenario.
David, just on that point, I mean, we've had a number of companies that have come to us looking for our assistance because they've had those types of situations. And I think you underserve the legal entanglement that happens there, because if someone in your someone sends an email from your organization with your invoice, with your banking information, and the person who receives it pays it, then the legal question is, who's at fault, right? And so we've seen and been witness to a number of legal actions over the years where it becomes very unclear. And so at the very minimum, it delays you getting the money you deserve for your product or service. And it can delay it substantially. At worst case, you'll be found at fault and won't ever receive that money for those products or services. So it's really important to kind of understand here that there is some risk. And as David points out, you don't automatically see that risk. And just an action item for the group here is go into your Outlook or O365 or OWA, however you log into your email, and check your rules. Just go through them and make sure that there aren't any in there that don't look familiar, because that's troubling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so our system, our service would identify that email forwarding rule in real time once it's generated. Pre-existing, obviously, we would need to review that up front with the client, understand what rules are supposed to be in place and which ones aren't. That's part of our onboarding. And then from there, we would monitor for these types of rules being implemented and then forward them for approval, or at least to identify that they've occurred so the client can be aware that these things are in place. And obviously, if there's specific users that are considered more higher risk, then we would create and scrutinize that activity a little more, and build that into our playbooks and in our risk scores, as I'll demonstrate in our dashboards. Another scenario here is, an employee forwarding their email to their personal mailbox. This may happen for convenience. It may happen because they're looking to leave and they want to start forwarding information that they feel is theirs or their intellectual property, whether that's relationships or previous sales or pricing. We see this very often. And where the challenge really lies is not necessarily when the employee is currently employed, but when they leave the organization. We see this very often in sales roles, where an organization will have a salesperson leave and they'll keep the mailbox open, but they'll change the password and redirect that email to either a boss or a colleague to cover that client base in the transition. And when that email rule existed and that email forwarding occurred, that rule still exists. So that person in theory could still gain access, because that email, that once it hits the inbox, is forwarding to that personal mailbox continuously. And it's not been broken because the forwarding rule to the new person doesn't change that rule. It exists on the mailbox. And so we see organizations that have a person that left and they're still able to see all the inbox information and all that email. So that's really important, and it really obviously can impact an organization, whether that's malicious or not. And maybe that's even allowed in some of your organizations because people don't like to have multiple things, or their phone. It's a pain to jump from one email to the next. We see this very often where organizations allow this and they don't necessarily understand the impact of the ramification, or they don't have a proper offboarding documentation so that when the person leaves, it continues to exist. I had a client about a year or two ago insist that they were breached because these things were happening, and they had talked about this scenario about someone leaving, and we talked to them about this, and potentially like the fact that their wireless had like a guest network and they could sit in the parking lot and get on the network and see these things too. And so those two things obviously were identified, and that's how this old employee was still able to see what was going on. And so it's usually not as sophisticated as you think in some cases. Again, we review and detect those email forwarding rules, and we put alerts on sharing of information. So as I mentioned earlier, in Teams and SharePoint and OneDrive, it's very easy to share information. Most of your information is now starting to migrate into 365, whether it's just proposals and quotes, or if it's intellectual property or financial information. It's typically existing in some file share within Microsoft 365 now. And how that information gets shared and distributed is the same way. It's pretty open and free. It's the cloud. And if you share a link and you share that document, it doesn't necessarily throw up a red flag. There are some DLP rules or data loss prevention rules that can be enabled in 365. And once those are, we would see all those alerts, and then we would start to scrutinize that and work with our clients with ICS to start to identify and create information security policies and data loss prevention policies of how are we handling data and who's allowed to share and who do we share with and is it encrypted, et cetera. And so those are things that are probably happening in your environment today, and it's not even on your radar because it's not being pointed out so that you can start to understand what the potential impact and risk would be to the organization. And our third scenario is one that we're starting to see more and more of. So many of you have enabled multi-factor authentication, which was highly recommended and still is today. But it's not a silver bullet. And none of these things that we're talking about today are really silver bullets. We talk about a defense in-depth approach, and we continue to try to layer different levels of tactics and to try to look a little more secure than our neighbor. So there's extra effort involved. If you only have your username and credentials, then they can gain access without you even ever knowing. So if you have multi-factor and they have your username and password, and you have a push notification through either Microsoft or Duo or Okta, these multi-factor authentication platforms, you'll probably receive a notification on your device or perhaps a tablet or PC. What we're seeing is this MFA fatigue attack is they'll gain access through that username and password, and then they'll use a bot or a script or just manually do it, and they will just hammer the user over and over and over again to accept the notification. They could be in a meeting, they could be working, and their phone just keeps going off, like continuously. And if they continue to ignore it, they may even be prompted with an email or some way of social media that may be contacted to say, hey, this is your IT department, we're doing an update, you have to accept that to make this stop. We saw that scenario play out in the most recent Uber attack. This is how an 18-year-old was able to gain access to Uber. They found a user's name and password. They hammered them. They basically sent them a message in Slack, which is like a messaging service, to say this is your IT department. We're doing an update. If you don't accept this, you're going to continue to see these notifications on your phone. They did. That user was able to use that access to gain access into their environment, and then start to send messages to the entire organization and their vendors that they had been breached and start to exfiltrate information. And it was that easy. We're seeing this in organizations of all sizes. We're seeing this, our insurance companies seeing this, the threat intelligence community seeing this. This has been a new method that we've seen in the last 6 months, and we continue to see it ramping up. Number of things that you can do. You can train your end users and make them more aware. We can start to build some procedures into Microsoft. Okta and Duo have an answer to this in the last month or so, and they have the ability now to alert when multiple failed login attempts occur or multiple MFA notifications are sent. There's also the possibility that this user's logging in from a different geolocation, which means they're logging in from another country while this other user is in the US. That could potentially throw an alert. So we have a number of different ways to identify this when it's occurring. And we also have ways to identify when it has occurred. So once it's occurred, what they typically do is they'll change the methodology, or they'll add a second device to be the authentication device. And once they do that, now they can authenticate themselves to get on your network. And in some cases, they'll run in tandem with 2 devices. In other cases, they'll just shut that user out and take control. It all depends on their process and methodology. But when that second factor authentication device is added, that will also throw an alert to our SOC team, the security operations team, and we would identify that and escalate that as an alert. Okay, I'm going to jump into some of our security dashboards and walk through some of the scenarios that we see in our security operations center. So what you see here is a couple different dashboards for our organization. This is the impossible travel alert map here. So we see somebody logging in from the East Coast and the West Coast within a few minutes. That's going to throw an alert. We have some risky users up here. All this information is blocked out because we redacted it for
Security reasons.
Users anonymous. Yes, we didn't want everyone to know that that's Brian over there in the corner. So in here is the same thing. This is kind of a threat map, and it shows your riskiest users and why. And some of this is, our stages and methodology. So this is someone trying to gain a foothold. This is exfiltration. This is most likely some type of data being leaked, multiple users deleted. So you see that activity there, and that throws an alert. This is a SharePoint policy change. So someone changed the policy that said you can share any link in the organization, or versus encrypted only to company staff, things like that. And then we have a user login anomaly, which is something I'll dig into in the next screen. Login time anomaly. So, George logs in every day, typically between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. And now we're seeing an extensive number of logins at 2 a.m. on a Sunday, and may or may not be from the same location, but still throws an anomaly. And that's going to throw up an alert. And then the impossible travel we talked about. The next slide here is just some more of these alerts. As we drill down into them, you can kind of see more data. This is really for our security team. You have access to this if you would like to see it. Most of our clients that work with ICS would use this and then escalate and triage based on the information. So our team is feeding ICS and our clients like some basic information and kind of put it in layman's terms so that it's not all code based, and you don't have to be a security engineer to understand what this ID means, because we break it down to you in simple terms. It says, hey, this person was logging in from Germany and San Jose within a 5-minute period, probably an issue. Do you want to look into that? And it has a score of 69. And so here, this is an external logon failure. Hard to see, it's a little small, but essentially what this means is someone tried to log in externally and it failed multiple times. Not that big of a deal. It scores a 9. However, what we see here is that they tried to log in several times, failed, and then there was a successful log on. Now that 9 turns into a 91, and we're going to start taking action and escalating that. Here's another one. This is the anomaly, right? So this isn't necessarily a suspicious travel, but they logged in from a location within Northport, Florida, which they don't typically log in from. This user may be Northeast based, and now we're seeing a login from Florida, and they're starting to move data around that they haven't moved around before, and so that's going to throw up a medium risk score, and we're going to watch that and analyze that, and then escalate accordingly. So here's just some of the scenarios that we see that's outside of a normal network operations team. They're looking for uptime and access and availability, where we're saying, hey, this is a little odd for this user to be doing these types of things. Do we want to take another look and dig down deeper? In here, this is our vulnerability scanner. So this is running on a weekly basis, internally and externally. And we're identifying all of these new vulnerabilities that may be built into existing applications. It could be part of your firewall management software. It could be applications on the user's devices. It could be inline business applications. Sometimes they're buried in something that's from that manufacturer. Like Cisco had, a management tool, and within that management tool, the code it was written on had a vulnerability, so it needed to be updated. We see these honestly on a daily basis. The most critical ones we escalate manually, and then these ones we review with the client on a quarterly basis. But we send these vulnerabilities to the ICS team, and they prioritize based on the criticality and the number of users. We can break it down by the devices, the application, and then you can see here this particular application has 231 critical, 511 medium, and then we can drill down, and within here we have very specific information of why it's a risk, how to remediate the risk, the link to upload the patch. So it's very self-explanatory. And then over time we can show improvements to the environment. We can show that initially we had this many vulnerabilities that were this old in the wild. Let's say there's 500 vulnerabilities that are over 30 days old. Maybe they're most likely over 90 to 360 days old if you haven't done this regularly up to this point. And then over time you reduce that to 30 days to 15 days versus 90 to 360. So you're closing that window, reducing that risk and the landscape. So just jump here. So why is core right for your business? Well, we provide this managed response around 365, SharePoint, monitor for suspicious activity. We have log management, quick and hassle-free deployment. Because it's a single API integration, we typically get our clients up and running and connected into our infrastructure within the first 5 business days. And then we do a 7 to 10 day baselining. It's no longer than 2 weeks, depending on the size of the client. And once that's baselined, we're actively alerting day 1 or day 5 once we're implemented, and then that baseline gives us some more of that anomalous behavior, so we know what unique looks like, and we would know that that user doesn't normally log in from Florida because they're based in the Northeast, et cetera. And then the vulnerability scanning, we can set that up as well in the first 3 to 5 business days. So it's really quick and easy. If you're looking at enterprise solutions that include a full-blown SIM and all these other things, it's typically a 90 to 120 day ramp where we can provide immediate return on investment to our clients within the first week or so. The other reason, obviously, we talked about in the beginning of the presentation, business email compromise and vulnerabilities are the 2 most common threat vectors. And so we feel that these are very important things that our clients should be working on to help improve and strengthen their environment. And by doing this, they're adding layers of protection. Speaking of that, we have what is referred to as the defense in depth. These are the top 10 things that Integer believes every organization should be doing to help secure their environment and their data. This is very closely aligned to the White House memorandum that came out last year, basically saying the same thing, that all businesses should be taking cybersecurity seriously and building it into their organization and having senior leadership sponsor that throughout the organization. Business continuity and backup, endpoint, enhanced detection and response, and user awareness training are typically included in your ICS agreement. If you don't have multi-factor or 2-phase authentication for your VPN and administrative accounts and 365 accounts, it is highly recommended that you do that. It's essentially like putting a lock on your door. It just adds that extra layer, and it is really cost effective and adds a definite stronger layer of protection. From there, we add the continuous vulnerability management, which is what I mentioned on that one in the screen, and showed how we identify these new vulnerabilities in the wild continuously. And then an XDR SIM solution is collecting logs and reviewing them. And it's typically reviewing them across the entire infrastructure. We're going to do it, kind of dip our toe in the water there with some of this behavior analytics and log collection and investigation, to do it on that single log source of Microsoft 365. And then with that, we can actively monitor for threats and detect them in Microsoft 365. And then as you move into more maturity, add other sources to those devices, which makes it very easy. If you ever wanted to grow and start adding other things into it, it's very easy to do that because we already have the infrastructure built. And from there, we start to build out incident response management and playbooks, tabletop scenarios, ongoing risk assessments, and that proactive review and validation, which you're getting some of with the 365 onboarding. We are inspecting and reviewing that environment and measuring it for baseline security on a regular basis.
So just a couple of things to point out, David.
Mm-hmm.
One, I'm going to guess 80 to 90% of the folks on this call have cyber liability insurance. It's either connected to their current and E's and O's insurance policies, or it is separate and distinct. All or most have filled out the cyber liability insurance questionnaire in order to kind of renew their policies. Those questionnaires are growing and getting more detailed, and we expect that the cyber liability insurance companies will begin underwriting based on the responses to those policies. Kind of historically, we've seen, hey, you've got to do these 15 minimum things in order to be insured. I think we're going to see those underwriters move to, hey, if you do these 30 things, not only will you be insured, but you'll pay a lower premium. So I think that's an important point to point out. The other things that I think we ought to kind of recap on are data leakage, right? Every organization out there has some level of intellectual property, whether it's customer lists, patents, trademarks, drawings, diagrams, their unique selling process, etc. Those are all now in your Microsoft environment, even if you're not using OneDrive and SharePoint, because they traverse your email system. And so to the extent that you have visibility and control of that intellectual property as it moves throughout your organization, I think it's really important. And so the core services that David described will help you identify and react to any changes in the way information is shared. The other piece is this MFA fatigue. In our industry, we thought MFA was going to be the key to all of our email compromise problems, right? If we got MFA into all of our customers, that multi-factor authentication that's so painful for some, that would solve this problem. Well, the cyber criminals, as they usually do, they are attempting to stay one step ahead of us, and so now they've, as David pointed out, they've created ways to get around multi-factor authentication. So, and then the last piece is really kind of controlling the rules and the way your employees use data, right? And sharing data. In the old days of a file server and on-premise exchange, you could see a lot of that, and rarely did data move outside of your, the physical walls of your building. Now there's a little bit, as David said, security and convenience don't necessarily always align, right? We've made, getting and sharing data a lot easier with the Microsoft suite. But with that ease comes risk. And so being able to see if, your salespeople are downloading, customer lists, or your engineering folks are sharing, CAD files, or, any of those kind of real world examples that we've seen throughout, the 500 or 600 customers that we have, is I think impactful to your organization. So that was the purpose for building out this solution. Because you're our clients and we care about you, we wanted to make sure we communicated that to you. We are making it very easy. If you'd like to learn more and or participate with this, we're offering a pretty heavy incentive, and we have priced this to make this affordable for everybody on this webinar. So everybody who's on this webinar, just by attending, will receive more information and a proposal that is customized to your individual organization. And if you have any questions, comments, would like to learn more, we're happy to jump in and help and further explain these services. Your ICS technical account manager or sales person is well versed in this and can help.
We want to say thank you to everyone for coming in today, and we appreciate you all joining. We thank you for being a client and trusting ICS to be your managed service provider. And
we did have a couple.
Questions. Yeah,
we had a couple of questions. Someone out there was having technical difficulties and the slides weren't moving for them. So if you'd like a recording of this, just reach out to any of your ICS representatives. We'll have a recording of this session available. Another person had asked a question about the relationship between ICS and Integer. We kind of addressed that early on, but I'll restate it. ICS is a separate and distinct division. Integer is a separate and distinct division of ICS. And when I say separate and distinct, I mean their employees are separate from ICS employees. Their systems are separate from ICS systems. And so we do that because we think that there's a reason to have, no pun intended, a firewall between our security division and the division that helps kind of support the day-to-day needs of each of our customers. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, Brian. Just we really want to separate network operations from security operations. It's really hard to share those resources and their mindset because they're not necessarily aligned. Network operations' primary goal is to monitor and manage for uptime and availability and access. And those, again, aren't necessarily completely always aligned with security as a whole. We will look at security and identify what may happen, the likeliness and the impact, and with our clients, we'll determine their appetite for risk, whether they're going to mitigate that, reduce it, or accept that risk. And so just because there's a risk identified doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. Everybody has risk. Literally using 365 is a risk that you're going to leverage and balance with access and availability. And so we just kind of look at it with those lenses at all times with our clients, where separating those duties really, aligns for that strategy.
That was great, David. Thank you. I think we're just a little bit over our time here, but we do, again, appreciate everybody attending. Thank you very much. If you'd like more information, we're happy to provide it. Reach out to your ICS representative and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.